So it is a great pleasure to have with us today Professor Russell Epstein from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Epstein did a BA in physics at the University of Chicago and then a PhD at Harvard in applied mathematics with specialization in computer science, where he focused on learning object representations from grayscale images. He then did a postdoc at the Department of Psychology at Harvard University and at the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT with Professor Nancy Kanwisher. And this is actually, if I'm not mistaken, where he started his academic journey related to scene-related processing with his highly cited paper published in Nature about the discovery of the PPA together with Professor Nancy Kanwisher. He continued to another postdoc at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit at Cambridge, UK, with Professor John Duncan. After that, Professor Epstein joined the Department of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is now a full professor. He has published multiple books, book chapters, and dozens of peer-reviewed papers in top leading journals as Nature, Neuron, Ticks, Nature Neuroscience, Current Biology, annual reviews of Vision Science, and many more. He has given more than 50 invited talks about his research and has supervised dozens of postdoc, graduate, and research students. He's an elected member of the Memory Disorders Research Society, an elected fellow of the Associations for Psychological Science. He was the keynote speaker at the Spatial Cognition Conference and the Presidential Symposium speaker at the Association for Psychological Science meeting. He studies the neural mechanisms underlying high-level vision and spatial navigation. Specifically, his lab studies the neural mechanisms underlying visual scene perception, event perception, object recognition, and spatial navigation in humans. His research focuses on both memory and perception, on navigation, examining both scene, place, landmark recognition, and spatial memory using multiple techniques as fMRI and additional cognitive neuroscience techniques. And this is in order to understand how scenes, objects, landmarks, events, and environmental spaces are represented in specific brain systems. So without further ado, I'm very happy to welcome you, Russell, to our seminar to hear about your exciting research. And thank you for joining us today.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me. This has been a wonderful series, as I found out relatively recently, but I got to see last week. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about cognitive maps, navigational strategies in the human brain. So spatial navigation is a problem that must be solved by all mobile organisms. So just to give an example, suppose I were in my office in the Goddard Labs at the University of Pennsylvania, and I wanted to get to the bookstore. I want to be able to choose a route that gets me there efficiently rather than kind of wandering around campus aimlessly. Okay, so how do I do this? Well, it's been appreciated for some time that there's more than one way to solve this problem. If I've been between these locations many times before, then I might be able to implement a response-based, or what you might call an action-based strategy. And that is, I might have just learned a sequence of actions that I will know will get me from point A to point B. To use this strategy, I don't actually need to know where anything is in space. I just need to remember the correct sequence of actions. A second way to solve the problem might be to use my knowledge about where things are in space. This is known as the cognitive map-based strategy. One implementation of this strategy might be to have some way of assigning coordinates to the environment. I can then represent my starting location, my goal location, and other points of interest in this coordinate frame. And route planning then turns into an abstract problem of vector computation. Knowing where these 2 points are in the coordinate frame, I can simply choose a bearing that will take me to my destination. So as these examples make clear, to navigate, you need some kind of navigational strategy, and some strategies involve using our spatial knowledge of the world, or cognitive map. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. But I'm actually going to talk about these in reverse order. First, I'm going to assume that navigation uses a cognitive map, and I'm going to ask the question, what is the format of the cognitive map in the human brain? And I'm going to tell you about some work in my lab that suggests that it doesn't necessarily take this nice Euclidean form as implied by this graphic, but has some additional structure. And then second, I'm going to tell you about navigational strategies, some work that we've been doing. Actually, I shouldn't, it's not unpublished. It's on bioRxiv mostly, but new work that suggests that our navigational strategies are actually not map-based or action-based, but actually something in between. So the first part of the talk focuses on spatial representations that are crystallized in memory, and the second looks at the representations and decisions that we make on the fly during navigation. And before I get going, I, of course, want to acknowledge the members of my lab that did most of this work. So the first part of the talk is almost all work by my former postdoc, Michael Peer. And the second part of the talk is work by my postdocs, Chris Ganstrom and Jiangang Liu. Okay. So first, cognitive maps. What are they? Well, the idea of a cognitive map, as I imagine many of you know, was developed by Edward Tolman, looking at behavior of rats. This was work back in the 1930s and 40s that he did at UC Berkeley. And he observed that the behavior of the rats indicated that they had something that seemed like a map in their head that allowed them flexibility to reach their navigational goal, even in some cases when taking paths that they had never taken before. This idea gained additional support from John O'Keefe and Jonathan Dostrowski's discovery of place cells in the rodent hippocampus, which fire when the animal is in specific locations. And in a famous book published in 1978, O'Keefe and Nadal argued that these hippocampal place cells are the neural substrate for the cognitive map. And we now know that in addition to place cells that fire in specific locations, there are also in the rodent brain grid cells that fire in a regular array of locations that tiles the environment, head direction cells that fire as a function of the heading direction, the direction that the animal is facing. And together, these cells, along with an additional menagerie of cells, allow the animal to represent its current position and heading. And recent work suggests that they can also be used to plan a route to one's destination. So that's rodents. What about humans? Well, in the past 15 years or so, numerous fMRI studies have observed evidence for similar responses in the human brain, evidence for coding of key elements of a cognitive map, such as distances between locations, directions that one is facing or that one intends to travel, and even grid-like responses. And just to give you one of my favorite examples, here's a study that my former graduate student, Lindsay Morgan Vass, did, I guess, almost 15 years ago. What she did was something, it's actually very simple. We scanned students from our university, the University of Pennsylvania. We showed them a lot of different pictures, and they were all of 10 landmarks from the Penn campus. So here you see the landmarks. Here you see their locations on campus. And in this experiment, it was very simple. The subjects would just see a picture at a time. Every time they saw a picture, they were asked to press a button when they recognized the landmarks. They were not asked to think about where the landmarks were in space or anything about the distance between them. But despite this fact that was sort of this very low-level task, we saw a very strong activation in the left anterior hippocampus that related to distances between the landmarks. And in particular, what it was is that the activity in the left anterior hippocampus when looking at one landmark scaled with the distance between that landmark and the landmark on the immediately preceding trial. So this shows that the hippocampus has information about which landmarks are close together and which landmarks are far apart, which is a key element of a cognitive map. Okay, so we have evidence for cognitive maps in rodents and human brains, but what do we mean by this? What exactly is a cognitive map? Well, the classical view as put forth by O'Keefe and Nadal is that cognitive maps are, unified Euclidean reference frames. So they wrote in their book, absolute space embodies the notion of a framework or container within which material objects can be located, but which is conceived as existing independently of particular objects or objects in general. In this book, we will be sticking our necks out and taking the strong position that the metric of the cognitive map is Euclidean. So a Euclidean reference frame, if you have it, is something that's very powerful because it allows you to define two things. First, distances between locations, and second, directions between locations. So the power of a map like this lies in its ability to define spatial vectors between any 2 points. an organism with this cognitive ability has great behavioral flexibility to navigate anywhere, even away from familiar routes. And even going back to Tolman's original work in the 1930s, this flexibility has always been seen as a hallmark of the cognitive map. However, when we look at behavioral evidence in humans, it doesn't really seem to support the idea that cognitive maps are just these Euclidean reference frames. So behavioral evidence suggests that our representations of real world environments are actually much more complex. So here's a figure I like a lot. This is from Kevin Lynch's 1960 book, The Image of the City. So Lynch was a geographer, not a psychologist, but I think his work is important. So what he did is he just asked people to describe their home city, in this case, Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States. And the map here reflects his collation of many different subject reports. And what you see is that people don't just represent the city in terms of a unified coordinate frame. Instead, they seem to represent it in terms of these structural elements, things like paths, edges, nodes, districts, and landmarks. So their cognitive map of the city is really quite structured. It's not just a sheet of graph paper laid on top of the environment. Now, one key aspect of that structure is that we tend to mentally divide larger spaces into subspaces. And the name I'll give to this mental operation is segmentation. So sometimes segmentation is implemented top down. For example, when we divide a city into neighborhoods, which Lynch probably would have called districts. And sometimes it's imposed upon us. For example, when we mentally divide the space inside a building into wings of the building or rooms within the building. So if we want to understand how real cognitive maps are organized, one of the first things we want to understand is how spatial segmentation is represented in the brain. Okay, so this gets us to our work. This is what Michael Peer and I set out to examine in a study that was published in Current Biology in 2021. We considered four possible ways that the segmentation of the environment might be represented in the brain. So consider, for example, here an environment that consists of four connected subspaces. And the dots here might indicate objects within the spaces whose locations that you want to encode into memory. So one possibility is you might have a fully integrated representation of that Euclidean representation that just represents all these object locations according to their absolute coordinates across all subspaces. A second possibility we considered is that we might see some evidence for grouping or clustering. So objects that are in the same room will be represented as having similar locations. Objects in different rooms will be represented as having different locations. A third possibility that we considered is that we might see some sort of remapping between the environments. So within each subspace, there might be a Euclidean representation, but these might consist of independent maps that are not necessarily related to each other. And then finally, a fourth possibility we considered is something we labeled schematization. So here again, one has maps that are at the scale of the subspaces, but rather than having four different maps, you have a single subspace map that is applied to all four subspaces, reflecting their common geometric structure. So in this case, objects that are in kind of equivalent locations, but in different rooms, will be represented as having a similar spatial location in the spatial schema. Okay, that was notional. I mean, that was just, here's what we actually did. Here's the environment we actually used. We created this virtual environment, we labeled the segmented courtyard. So it's a 150 by 150 virtual meter courtyard, and it contains 16 objects on plinths, on little platforms, which you can see numbered here. Now, the key aspect of this environment is that it's actually segmented into two subspaces by a canal. But because it's a canal, you can see over the canal, so the entire environment is co-visible. The canal can be crossed at two bridges, so you can go from one subspace to another. And before we put people in the scanner, we wanted them to really know very well the locations of these objects. So we had this extensive training procedure, both on the day before the scan and with a refresher on day two. And the key thing about this is that by the end of this training procedure, participants really knew where these objects were. So they could navigate without error to any of the 16 objects, even when no objects were actually visible. Okay, so they've encoded the object locations into memory. Just want to show you what this looks like. So here we're navigating around. You can see these different objects on these plinths. Here we're going over the river or the canal. Here we're on the other side. You can see that canal looks pretty scary. You can get from one side to another, but there's a clear division between these subspaces. And you can see to the other side as well. Okay. Then we put people in the scanner to look at neural representations. We actually scanned two different tasks. An object viewing task where you just saw the objects from the environment one at a time. And in this case, we gave them sort of like just an incidental task, which is on the screen. Is the object tilted to the left or the right? Just to make sure they're paying attention. So any spatial codes we see here are ones that are sort of brought up automatically since there's no explicit spatial task. But the second task was an explicit task. It was a judgment of relative direction task. This is used a lot in the spatial cognition literature. In this task, you were asked to imagine yourself standing at one object, facing a second object, and then you have to say whether a third object is to your left or to your right. So the key aspect of this is that it really requires you to imagine yourself being in that environment in a specific location. Okay. This is done in the fMRI scanner, so we then look at multivoxel patterns elicited during these tasks. And in particular, we look for patterns for the 16 different objects. We looked at the neural pattern similarity matrix, and then we're interested to see if the neural distances in different brain regions between the 16 objects relate to the spatial distances between them, but spatial distances that we would expect according to our four different hypotheses here. So one possibility is that the neural distances relate to their absolute distance in space, a fully integrated representation. We could also might expect to see, as I mentioned, grouping or clustering. So here, objects that are in the same subspace should have similar representations. Objects in different subspaces will have dissimilar representations. Remapping would be that there's coding of locations within the subspace, between objects within the subspace, but not across the canal. So two separate maps. And then schematization would be that we see coding according to distances, but not in the entire space, but the distances within that subspace map, where the two subspaces maps, you can imagine them overlaid on top of each other. So there's a common map that's applied to both subspaces. So four possible representational similarity matrices, and we tested for all four. Okay. Where did we look in the brain? We wanted to look at regions of the brain that we thought might encode this information. What are the areas that are involved in spatial navigation? It turns out that there is a sort of reliable network in the brain. If you look at this is a meta-analysis of 24 fMRI studies in navigation. We see that the areas that are commonly activated in these studies, hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, that's not surprising given the rodent literature, but also neocortical regions such as the parahippocampal cortex, the retrosplenial cortex, and do you see my maps at all? Or should I?
Sorry, if we see the maps?
Mouse. Do you see my
Oh, yeah,
mouse?
we see. Yeah, I think we do. Yeah.
Okay. And also this sort of.
No, sorry, Russell. I don't think so. I mean, I do see this
Oh,
blue dot,
okay.
but it's not moving, to be honest.
Okay. What about now?
Mm,
Oh, it's okay.
Yes,
I don't need. I
yeah,
don't need that. I just don't want to
with
be
with
pointing. Oh, you
with the
can see
red
it.
pointer,
Okay.
we do.
Okay. And also there's parahippocampal, retrosplenial, and also you can see there's parietal regions over here. Um, and actually these cortical regions, are not super surprising to see. They actually relate to something I've been studying even before I got into spatial navigation, which is the areas of the brain that are involved in processing visual scenes. So if you put people in the scanner, show them scenes, faces, and objects, there are three regions of the brain that tend to get more activated to the scenes. These are the retrosplenial complex, the parahippocampal place area, and the occipital place area. So for our regions of interest, we used hippocampus and entorhinal cortex. defined anatomically, and these three scene regions. Okay, what did we find? Well, in the hippocampus, what we saw was evidence for schematization. So the only model that actually fits the data, has a significant loading on the data, is the schematization model. And interestingly, these effects were localized to the left anterior hippocampus, which is the place we saw distance coding in the previous study. And this is during the object viewing task. We didn't find effects in the hippocampus during the judgment of relative direction task. And what about other regions? Well, we saw effects in the occipital place area and the retrosplenial complex, but somewhat different effects. So in the occipital place area, the highest loading is on the schematization model. There's a bit of a loading on the full integration model, but it's significantly less. And the retrosplenial complex, the highest loading is on the full integration model. There's a loading on the schematization model, but it's less. And actually, through analysis, these models, as you can see, are at least somewhat correlated with each other. So it's not necessarily surprising that both of them might explain some of the variance here. But actually, if we analyze the partial correlations, we see that actually the schematization model can fully explain response in the occipital place area. So if we can partial the integration model out, and we still get loading on the schematization model, not vice versa. In the retrosplenial cortex, if we partial schematization out, full integration remains significant, but not vice versa. So occipital place area seems to be doing schematization. Retrosplenial complex seems to be doing full integration. And these effects were found in this explicit task, the judgment of relative direction task. Okay, so schematization stuff we thought was pretty interesting. To get a better sense of what's going on, we attempted to visualize the representational space using multidimensional scaling. So I'm going to focus on the occipital place area just to illustrate this, because this is an area where the schematization effect was particularly strong. So here's the actual locations of the objects. Here's the sort of neural similarity space from multidimensional scaling. Looking at this, I don't expect you to make sense of this, but the structure starts to come out if we start coloring the objects in different ways. So if we divide this into the east objects and the west objects and look at where they fall in the neural similarity space, well, you can see the east and west are interdigitated with each other. And that makes sense because if you imagine there's a common space, you would not expect to see separation east to west. If we color according to north-south over the canal, you can imagine the common space, north and south, should remain separated in the common space. And indeed they do. And this should even be true of east and west within each segment, within each subspace, because if you overlay on top of each other, the east side of the segment and the west side of the segment should be distinct in that common space. And indeed, that is what we find. And I think this is just super cool because you can pretty much see directly how the representations are overlaid on top of each other in this schematic representation. Okay, so conclusions from this study. We find, I didn't show you the behavioral evidence, but in the study, there's also behavioral evidence. And here we show fMRI evidence that people mentally segment larger spaces into subspaces. We found some evidence that segmentation can be implemented by using spatial schemas to represent the subspace in the hippocampus in the occipital place area. And I just put this on the right up here to show that there is a similar effect in the rodent hippocampus, where sometimes you see these cells that fire in equivalent locations across multiple chambers. So here's a cell. If this is an environment that has 4 chambers all connected to a corridor, here's a cell that fires in the upper left in at least these 3 chambers, so the equivalent location seems like a spatial schema. But at the same time, we also see evidence for an integrated spatial code covering the entire environment. I will mumble here for a second just in case someone wants to ask a question, but if not, I can also wait to the end. So, all right, it's okay.
Yeah, I clearly have questions, but I'm also happy to wait until the end.
Okay. someone wants to raise a question at some point, please go ahead and do so, and hopefully, Sharon, you'll interrupt if I don't see it, which I probably won't. So, okay. So, having established this subspace organization, we then moved on to consider a second key aspect of spatial structure. So, in the previous environment, there were two subspaces that were joining each other and basically equivalent to each other. Um, but many of the environments that we encounter in real life are hierarchical. So, rooms are contained within buildings, which are contained within the campus. Um, you can imagine different ways of representing this. One is we could once again have a fully globally integrated representation of this entire space. But you could also imagine, and previous behavioral evidence suggests that we often represent these things by having representations in memory that are themselves hierarchical. Um, what do I mean by hierarchical representation? Well, in a spatial hierarchy, maps are encapsulated within other maps. So you have a map within of the different buildings that are then encapsulated within the map of the campus, which might be then encapsulated in a map of the city. So different spatial scales might have different mappings. And of course, this could be very advantageous. It's more computationally efficient than, say, encoding in a whole map of the city at a high resolution, and it gives you less working memory burden during a navigation. But a potential, I don't know if I should call it a downside, but an aspect of having this kind of representation is that if you need to integrate across the levels, you're going to need to use some kind of active cognitive process to understand the relationship between the levels. Okay, so to look at this, we developed a second environment that we call the nested courtyard. So this is a virtual environment that has an inherently hierarchical organization. Here's the top-down view. So it's a courtyard that contains a single building. So here's the courtyard and here's the building. The building is smaller. And the building can be entered through a single door on what I can call the west side here. And you can see that within the courtyard, the blue here indicates 16 different objects that are in this case on alcoves against the walls. And again, before we scan people, we train people so they know where all these objects are. And by the end, participants can navigate to all the objects even without error, even when only the alcoves are visible, when no objects are actually visible. Um, just to show you how this one looks, just take a second here. All right, so here we are in this courtyard. You can see we're going towards, here's one of the objects in alcoves. That one's a tree. And now there's that building. It's not a very exciting building, but we're gonna go inside. There's the single door, and you can see within there are 8 objects in alcoves there. Okay. In this case, we just scan people with the single task, the active task, judgment of relative direction. So on each trial, you imagine yourself standing in front of one object and have to report whether a second object would be to your left or to your right. And a key aspect here of the design is that we can manipulate whether this on a trial requires integration between the subspaces or doesn't. So in half of the trials, the object you're facing and the object that you have to say whether it's on your left or right, the target object are in the same subspace. So in that case, you just have to think about one of the subspaces, either the building or the courtyard. But in half the trials, the object you're facing and the target object were in different subspaces. So here you have to think about the relationship between the subspaces and you have to integrate between them. If this integration requires an active process, we would expect to see some evidence for this in the behavior, and in fact we do. As expected, the trials that require integration take longer than the trials that don't require integration, longer integration time. We also saw this unexpected effect of the location of the starting object, where reaction times were longer when you imagine yourself inside the building as opposed to the larger courtyard. We didn't expect this, and we don't quite know what it means, but importantly for our question here is that this does not seem to interact with the other effect. There's no interaction here. Okay. So we did see this integration cost in reaction time. What about brain responses? Okay, well, if we look at our five regions of interest here, so what this is showing here is for each of our five regions of interest, the overall activity, univariate activity for non-integration trials and integration trials. And we can see that pretty much in all regions we get some effect. In the retrosplenial complex in the parahippocampal place area, there's greater response for integration trials than non-integration trials. Interestingly enough, in the other three regions, we see the opposite effect. There's actually less activity for the integration trials than the non-integration trials. We definitely see effects of integration in, well, I guess at least four regions. The hippocampus here is marginal. If we do a whole brain analysis just to make sure we're not missing anything, we could see that on the this isn't corrected for multiple comparisons, but at least allows us to see, is there some other area that's showing a huge effect that we're missing? And the answer seems to be no. At least on the positive side, you can see the PPA and retrosplenial are the areas that come out here. The negative side is a bit messier here. And then, so it's nice that we see these brain effects. What do they mean? Well, if they are actually related to integration, we might expect to see a relationship between the neural and behavioral integration cost, and indeed we do. So here's a retrosplenial complex. We see that positive fMRI integration effect is correlated with the behavioral integration effect quite strongly. So from this is sort of consistent with the idea that integration across hierarchical levels is supported by an active neural process mediated at least in part by the retrosplenial complex. I think this is kind of nice because in the other study, the retrosplenial complex is the area that showed the integrative spatial code, and here we show that it's involved in active integration as well. But that's not the only region. These other areas seem to be involved as well. Okay. This is the end of the first part. What do we conclude? Cognitive maps have a rich structure that we see both in behavior and the brain. We do see evidence for an integrated map, but we also see evidence for segmentation into subspaces and some evidence for hierarchical organization. All this is seen in the navigational network, the medial temporal lobe, but also in these scene regions, the scene that play a key region in a key role in representing spatial structure of the world, not just the medial temporal lobe. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the second part. Okay, we're going to switch, switch gears or whatever, but so once you have spatial knowledge, then of course the question is, how do you use it? What navigational strategies do you use to implement a route to get from one place to another? And so to get at this, we have to go beyond the approach in part one. So, to study spatial knowledge, we use this approach of, we train people on an environment through these highly controlled learning paradigms, then scan them on these tasks that query their spatial memory. So that's all kind of like crystallized knowledge. Okay. To study navigational strategies, we have to have them actually navigate. We have to have them make their own decisions, and we have to have them navigate in the scanner if we want to look at brain responses. Okay, so here's what we did. We scanned participants while they navigated through a virtual reality city. So here's a ground level view of the city, and here's a map of the city. These red lines here actually represent the movement trajectory for one participant. Okay. Within the city, there are 12 different stores that act as potential goal locations. And those are important in the context of the task that the person was doing, which is a taxi cab task. This is a task that's been used a bit in the spatial navigation literature. What do you do? Well, you're told you're a taxi driver. You search around and you look for a passenger. When you pick up the passenger, you're told to take the passenger to one of the 12 goal locations. And actually then we had then when you reach the first goal location, you're told to take the passenger to a second goal location. And then when you reach the second goal location, then you search for a passenger again and just keep cycling on and on and on. So this requires you to navigate through the whole environment with occasionally taking passengers to specific goals. Um, I'll just show you a ground level view here, and I'll mention that there are actually two versions of the city that we use, City version 1 and City version 2. They have the exact same spatial layout, but they have different ground textures and colors and textures on the walls. So this allows us to use one city as a perceptual control for the other while retaining the same spatial organization. So to start this movie, these are not matched for trajectory, even though they start at the same point. So you can see what navigating around from ground level looks like. I don't know if we're going to win any video game awards here, but I think it's a reasonably plausible environment. Okay. Okay, what do we do? So we actually had each subject for quite a bit of time over a period of 6 to 7 days. Days 1 and 2 were just behavioral training, 15 minutes of free exploration, 15 minutes of finding the stores, and then you do the taxi cab task for 30 minutes. And then day 2 is just another hour of taxi cab task. So by the end of this, they know pretty much where all the goals are. They know where things are. Then we put them in the scanner for 3 days. We scan them while doing the taxi cab task in City version 1. And then on day 6 and 7, we bring them back and we tell them, well, war's broken out in your city. It's still the same city, but it looks different, and you're still a taxi driver, and you do that for 2 more days. So a key thing here is that we got a lot of data from each of these subjects. We thought that this was going to be important. Okay. Now, before I get to the strategies, the first thing we did with the data was just to see if we can observe any navigationally relevant spatial information. So those of you who know fMRI, my guess this is actually pretty challenging because fMRI looks at a signal that relates to the hemodynamics. So it's a sluggish response. Any putative neural event gets smeared out in the fMRI over several seconds. And this is going to be difficult if we want to look for something like the direction you're heading, because that is going to change, and it often will change on a faster time scale than the fMRI response. So to get around this, we used an analysis approach known as the voxel-wise encoding model, and I won't get into it, even though it was like several years of work on our part. But I just wanted to show you some results to show you that this works. So here we're looking for voxels whose activity contains information about heading direction, the direction you're facing at any moment. And so on the right are the results across 15 subjects. So these are on flattened maps. So here are the two hemispheres. Back of the brain is here, front of the brain is here. And you can see that there are actually two peaks of activity here of regions that seem to respond very strongly relating to your heading direction. One is the retrospinal complex, our old friend, and the second is sort of farther up in the superior parietal lobe. And actually, this was pretty nice for us to see because these are actually the brain regions that have been identified in previous studies using sort of static paradigms as representing your heading direction or facing direction. We were happy that we could see these during navigation, active navigation, despite all the challenges of using fMRI. Okay, that's not what I wanted to talk to you about, but I just want to show you that this works. And also, if you work on something for years and years, you want to show at least one slide. Okay. Now I want to go on to the main question, though, I want to ask, which is what are the navigational strategies that people use? So in other words, how do they choose their paths? Okay. So we decided to sort of take a cue from the reinforcement learning literature and look at sort of 3 classes of algorithms that you might use to choose your route. First, model-based algorithms. So these are something like a cognitive map. where you represent the spatial structure of the environment. So in this case, it might be the connectivity of the environment between different locations. Um, Second thing, going back to my example right in the beginning, uh, we wanted to test what paths you would take if you had a model-free, a response-based strategy. In this case, what you learn is just the value of the actions that you take at any particular location, but not necessarily how the locations are connected to each other. And finally, we wanted to test this third idea that's very popular recently in the reinforcement learning literature, and that's the possibility that people might choose their paths by using a successor representation. And what you represent here is not the full transition matrix, but something that's called a multi-step future occupancy matrix. And I'll explain a little later on exactly what that means. Um, why these three types of representations? Well, there's this idea that these three kinds of representations sort of relate to each other. They sort of trade off flexibility and efficiency. Model-based representations are very flexible. That's the hallmark of the cognitive map, but they can be very inefficient, very laborious to plan a route. Model-free representations are very efficient at every point. You know which action you think you're supposed to take, but they're not very flexible. And successor representations are believed to sort of trade off and show aspects of both. Okay. So those are what we wanted to test. Our analytical approach was to compare human behavior to train reinforcement learning agents on the same navigational problems that the humans were given, sort of see which paths they choose and compare this to human behavior in two ways. First, we want to see which model, which algorithm sort of best fits human performance levels. And second, which one actually predicts the navigational choices that people make. And then since we have the fMRI signal, we also wanted to look for fMRI signals that correlate of model components. Okay. Um, to to use these algorithms, all of them use a formalism in which the environment is divided into states with transitions between states. So to implement this, we hand define 39 states based on the structure of the environment. So things like, as you see on the left, corridors and intersections. So the idea is that this state structure sort of relates to the granularity of the decisions that people are actually going to have to make when navigating around in the world. Okay. And I promise you, I would tell you a little bit more about what this is, what you learn for successor representation. So what you learn is the algorithm learns in the successor representation is this thing called the successor matrix. And the matrix shows a relationship between your current state and future states. And each row here represents the sort of discounted likelihood of representing future states from your current state. So let's say, for example, here's the actual values after learning for state 14. What you see here is that the highest value for state 14 is state 14, because if you're in state 14, you're pretty likely to come back to state 14, soon. And the next values are the adjoining states, and the ones farther away have the lowest values. So what this basically is, it ends up reflecting the structure of the environment, because the structure of the environment constrains where you can go, but it's also influences about the paths that you actually taken in the past. So it can be affected by your policy because it reflects, your stored knowledge about how likely you were to go to other states from that state. Okay. So what did we find? So on the left shows the performance of, in this case, the successor representation agent across trials. Again, we give them the same problems that the humans gave. What you see is that in the beginning, they're taking pretty bad paths. So this is how far off their paths were from the optimal path. But after a while, they learn. And by the time they're in the area where we have fMRI data, they've actually, doing pretty well. We zoom in here to this later stage, and now we can compare to the humans and to the model-based and model-free agents. We see that the successor representation is making some errors. That's actually similar to the humans. The humans are not optimal. They are making some errors. Model-based agents actually by this time know everything, so they always take optimal paths. That's not like humans. And model-free agents are actually doing pretty poorly. They make a lot of errors. Um, Averaging across all subjects and all problems, what we see here is that the best match for the behavior level is the successor representation. Um, the model-based algorithms are significantly better than humans, and the model-free algorithms are significantly worse. So it seems like the successor representation is a pretty good model, at least with regard to performance level. Um, then, of course, we want to know, okay, it's getting there at about the same rate as humans. Taking paths are about as good, but is it actually making the same decisions as humans? So we wanted to look at this. So this is just showing here's a path through this matrix from, say, state 7 to state 27. And we can ask, okay, if you're at state 14, um, the agent made a decision, the human made a decision. Are the human decisions and the agent decisions the same decisions? And then so we can fit this using a Bayesian information criteria. And here, lower means better fit to the humans. And what we see is that, again, the successor representation is the best fit. Model-based is doing pretty well. So it's not a bad model for humans, but successor representation is better. And the model-free is not making the same decisions. So that's two pieces of evidence that the successor representation seems to reflect human behavior. I know I seem deep in the weeds, but I'm actually pretty close to the end of this talk. So, all right. Finally, what about fMRI responses? Okay, so we reasoned that if people were actually using some version of this algorithm to guide their behavior, that we would see fMRI signals corresponding to the internal components of the algorithm. And really, very much to my surprise, we did indeed see this. So, for example, in every state, this you could say what is the absolute value of the successor matrix at the state you're in when you're at that state. This is going to go up and down over time as you move from one state to another, from one place to another. And we can see is there a region of the brain where activity goes up and down according to this, and we actually see this in the anterior hippocampus. It seems to track the successor matrix row value. Another thing we looked at is a quantity that's used as you move around to update the successor matrix. It's just called the successor prediction error, which is basically the difference between the row that you're in now and the row that you were just in. This also goes up and down over time. And we see a very strong signal in our neocortical regions. And actually, I say this is not corrected for multiple comparison. This just jumped out of this without any hypothesis, very strong effect. Um, and these four regions where we see this effect actually overlap almost exactly, not necessarily with the classical scene regions, but with this place memory network that Adam Steele and Caroline Robertson have been talking about. So these are regions of the brain that respond when you imagine familiar places. Here's data from our lab using this paradigm, and you can see that these activations are almost exactly the same activations. I don't know what this means yet, but it's just very, very striking, both the strength of the effect and the overlap with this other network. So we're trying to figure this out. Okay. Project is still ongoing, but here's what we found so far. So we did find that these algorithms can model human navigation through a complex environment, even with multiple interleaved goals, which I think is something that hadn't been looked at before. Our best fitting model is the successor representation. I'll mention here that the version we use is one that has something that has a replay component. I can talk about that in the questions if you're interested in. Even though I didn't get into it here, it matches human behavior. And we see fMRI signals that correspond to internal components of the successor representation in the hippocampus and this cortical navigation network. So, of course, the challenge for the future is to try to put these two parts of the talk together. How do we integrate the findings here in these different reinforcement learning algorithms with the sort of spatial knowledge framework that I talked about in the first part of the talk? We're working on that. I don't have a good answer for that yet. Okay, just to summarize what I showed you today, first part on cognitive maps, I showed evidence that cognitive maps can be segmented using spatial schemas and that We seem to have hierarchical representations that we actively integrate across hierarchical levels. And the second part, I showed you evidence that from both behavior and fMRI, that successor representations are a good model for navigational behavior. With that, I want to thank my lab, I guess, thank my funding agencies as long as they still exist for now, and you for listening. And so I will now open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Russell. So I want to invite everybody to unmute yourself, and we're going to give a big applause. Really exciting talk. I mean, I've got lots of questions. So I see there's one question, but I do want to start and ask top down, my first question with respect to the navigational strategies and the cognitive maps. So do you think that in a way, I mean, I think the cognitive maps are somewhat based on our experiences through space.
Yeah.
They also learn. So I wonder how much of this action and basically, let's say, the exploration history is embedded. I mean, there's also an aspect of energy and, barriers. Some barriers are more dangerous, as you've shown us. And
Yeah.
so I wonder if you think these experiences are built into the maps or are influencing one another, like the navigational strategies eventually assist or limit or the cognitive maps that can be
Yeah.
built.
So I think there are two things I'll say in response to that. I guess the first thing is in the short term, the successor representation is very interesting because it reflects the structure of the environment, but it also reflects your navigational history. And so, seeing these results and other results in the literature, but of course you believe it more when you see it in your own results, have really made me think that maybe what we end up representing is not a pure representation of the spatial structure of the environment, but is something that is going to be shaped by your recent history in ways that could lead to kind of spatial distortions essentially, or you know, and that is if that successor representation is in fact your key. What you actually encode or what the hippocampus actually encodes, you will see something like this. And I'll mention that actually the replay component, which I didn't talk about, ends up being potentially important because it sort of allows you to not get as influenced as you might otherwise be by your recent history because you can replay other things. And I think of it as like potentially keeping the cognitive map tuned up, and not getting too influenced by, what you did recently. The second thing I'll mention that kind of seems relevant to your question is that, there's this debate in the discussion in the literature about, do we represent cognitive maps or cognitive graphs? Where a cognitive map, classically is like a coordinate frame, and cognitive graphs is like this connectivity structure. And we've argued that you probably represent both, and the extent to which you represent one or the other is going to depend on the structure of the environment. So, for example, in a sort of closed-in environment of corridors, somewhat like the city, your representation is going to look probably kind of graph-like. And the fact, in fact, all these algorithms are using a graph-like representation. And that seems to work okay. If you have an environment that has more open spaces, then you will probably start to see something that looks more like that classical cognitive map. So I hope that at least speaks somewhat. Thank you for the question. It allowed me to say some things I wanted to say. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm sure there is so much more to explore, and no answer is definite. And
Uh-huh.
yeah, definitely.
Cool.
Um, yeah, Mel, do you want to?
Yeah, it's kind of an extension of what you were just talking about. And I just wondered, I mean, for generations, many people have lived, for example, in the dense Amazon rainforest. Other people live in open plains. And I wondered whether or not it speaks to individual differences and the effect of the environment. But I wondered do you think there are deeply embedded or default strategies that people might have by virtue of their upbringing in different kinds of environments? And has anyone thought about that or looked at that
Yeah, I think
possibility?
that's something that's of interest in the spatial cognition literature. There's at least one study that compared people who grew up in Salt Lake City to, I can't remember, it was an Italian city. So one might certainly expect there to be differences according, North American cities, often very rectilinear, thinking in terms of a
Right.
coordinate frame is something you can easily do. European cities, not so easy. I at least often get lost because I'm still trying to get my coordinate frame going. So there's some, I think there's maybe not as much as one would like. And I think that's a quite interesting open question,
Right.
So
And you could imagine that it would be uh, altered to some degree by the emergence of paper maps of the world, the
yeah,
use of Google Maps and other
yeah.
aerial drones that give some idea of the layout that one would never have from simply wandering around the surface.
Yes, and there's some interesting work from some we did one study on the Penn campus, and we found evidence that even just even in fMRI responses, that there was something special about north, yeah, the north heading, which kind of surprised us because the Penn campus is laid out east to west, but somehow at least in retrosplenial, north seem to have like particularly reliable organization, and that sort of maybe consists with the idea that um, you see the map facing to the north, so you sort of develop that as like a primary direction. There's also a study done, I think, by my former postdoc Steve Marchetti when he was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins that found a similar effect in behavior at Johns Hopkins, even though their maps are actually, I believe, aligned with west
Yeah,
at the top. But I guess people are so used to thinking about north that north has a sort of special.
special place. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't imagine we would find that in animals if we could do the equivalent study. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting open question. So,
Just to follow up, I believe there was a group in Germany that had a belt that people wore, which gave haptic signals where north was, so
right.
that and I just wonder whether people who have been trained on that had ever been examined. That would be a fascinating study in itself. When you give people an extra cue as to
Yeah.
the way in which the world is laid out.
I know those studies exist, and I know that Steve Weisberg, who had been a postdoc at Penn, was working with, well, many years ago, looking with a similar thing. And all I remember is that it was not as effective. I don't want to speak for Steve, but as one might have hoped. But yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Um, Russell, I also want to ask about, I mean, it's follow up on the issue of individual differences that Mel raised, but I'm thinking about I mean, you said you trained the participants to be like, ceiling performance
Yeah.
before they started this. But so first of all, I wonder, I mean, probably well, maybe not, but there may have been individual differences in the speed that they learned the environment, and
Mhm.
if you have any inputs or data about their navigation abilities in regular, because there are people who, really
Yeah.
have difficulty navigating, and those that are really that find
Hmm.
it really easy. And I wonder if looking into these individual differences, one of the regions that you are indicating is in a way reflecting this variance and not looking at let's say
Yeah.
the mean or the across the population.
Yeah. I mean, individual differences in spatial ability are profound. And they're really interesting, and they seem very uncorrelated with other things, right? So, many people are brilliant at many things, I remember many years ago when I was going around giving my job talk, and so many like brilliant scientists would say like, I suck at navigation, I can't find my way around. So, and there's huge variability here. There's a bit of trade-off in this research, in my experience, which is if you want to look at individual differences, you need a lot of subjects, and if you want to start out, you probably want to start out trying to get people who actually can learn the task. So I don't think we have enough, and nor did we try to have enough variability here
Mhm.
to look at that. Um, and there's very interesting stuff. I mentioned Steve Weisberg when he was working with Nora Newcomb, and a little bit with myself, published a very interesting study on a virtual environment that was based on the Ambler campus at the University of Pennsylvania. Uh, and we sort of made a virtual city that had our virtual campus that had like two routes, and that you would learn, and then you would learn a connecting route. And people differ really quite a bit in their ability to integrate the routes. Some people can do it, some people can't do it at all. So um, that variability is out there, but looking at it with fMRI is is hard.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. That's really interesting. Morris raised his hand, if that's okay. Morris, do you want to yeah.
Here I am. I have a lovely talk, just terrific. The quick one question I had is whether you seem to, in your studies, you get people at the end stage after they become experts
hmm
at navigating through the spaces you talked about.
yeah.
If you were to take them at different transitions as they were learning, would you find some kinds of representations to be more prominent early on and change with time to the
You mean,
ones that you finally found?
yeah, I mean, I imagine you mean like in terms of the strategies or in terms of like the
Well,
con
both in terms of strategies and in terms of the representations that they form.
Right. So this goes back to Siegel, maybe all the way back to Siegel and White, with the idea that people learn environments in this sort of this sequential form, right? There's this old idea, that you learn the landmarks first, and then you learn the routes between them, and then finally you sort of integrate the routes into something that looks like a cognitive map. Um, Although my recollection is that this work, I'm thinking of Dan Mantello's work I'm going to get this wrong, I think Ishikawa, a while ago, that suggests that there are actually individual differences there, that some people, even from the beginning in the environment, will start to create like something that looks like a Euclidean reference frame, and other people don't. So um, I think we would. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to predict. I think the behavioral data doesn't necessarily suggest that there would be a clear sequence of representations that would be observed in all subjects. So yes. Um, did you have a specific hypothesis or something?
No, I was curious. I guess
Yeah.
part of the reason is that I'm interested in what happens to memories as they age. So that initially you form, and some
Yeah.
of the work that we've done with Hugo Spears
hmm
suggests that you initially rely on some structures and representations, and then
Right.
over time, once you become very, very familiar with the environment, you begin to rely on other structures and representations.
Yes. Yes. And I'm also sort of along the lines of what you've been studying for a while. Well, the role of the hippocampus, I think, is very interesting. We are in the first, in some of the studies I showed spatial representations in the hippocampus, but one might expect them to, I don't know, change over time, or because be less involved over time. We certainly would expect to see some kind of shift from the hippocampus to retrosplenial.
That's
Um,
right.
yeah. where I think it's really the locus of consolidated spatial knowledge. And my own conception of what's going on in the hippocampus, I feel is like I am I'm not certain that it is that is the best conceptualization to think of it as like, okay, there's a spatial representation there, even if it's like early on, as opposed to some sort of memory process that gets activated in some circumstances as opposed to others. So, I would certainly expect to see that kind of transformation. I'm not sure how to best characterize it. Um, we did a lot of studies. I only told you about one with data from the Penn campus. And I think the area where we most often see spatial information is retrosplenial. In some studies, like the one I showed you, there was clear spatial information in the hippocampus for that consolidated spatial knowledge. But other studies there isn't. So, um, you know, yeah. But I can't look at each study and say like, it's because of this factor, which they clearly kind of, that's why in the study we found stuff in the hippocampus, and other studies we did not. So, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
So Russell, although I have more thoughts and questions, I'll write to you a few of those
Okay.
to burden everybody with my thoughts. So again, I want to thank you a lot for joining us and for sharing with us your wonderful research. And thanks so much for joining us today. And next week there's VSS, so we're not going to be here, and more details about the following talks I will be sending by email, etc. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you in person in some near
Okay.
future point in some location.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.